Sign it, Rachel. The lender needs your name tonight.
Your credit can recover. His company may not. I'm not signing a debt I've never seen. Stop making this harder and sign the loan. Who is Noah?
How do you know that name?
Answer me. I spoke to an attorney. I will not sign.
What records did you give her? Are you trying to destroy me?
My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 36 years old, and at 11:43 on a Tuesday night in Columbus, Ohio, my husband placed an $86,000 loan agreement on our kitchen table and asked me to sign my name beneath a debt I had never seen, never approved, and had not known existed. Mark had already signed the final page. My name was typed beneath his, leaving an empty line where my signature was supposed to go. His mother, Diane, sat beside him with her purse still over one shoulder, watching me with the calm patience of someone who believed the difficult part of the evening was persuading me, not explaining why her son had hidden nearly $90,000 from his wife. Mark owned a residential remodeling company with 9 employees and several regular subcontractors. From the outside, he looked successful. His company trucks carried a polished logo, he sponsored a youth baseball team, and homeowners around Franklin County recommended him to friends. We lived in a comfortable 3-bedroom house north of downtown Columbus, contributed to retirement accounts, and had spent 9 years building what I believed was a stable middle-class marriage. I managed a dental practice with 4 dentists and 23 employees, so most of my working life involved schedules, insurance problems, payroll corrections, vendor invoices, and the quiet discipline of preventing small financial mistakes from becoming expensive ones. Mark used to admire that about me. Over time, he began treating the same habit as evidence that I worried too much. He explained that the construction company had experienced a difficult year. 2 clients had paid late, material prices had increased, and several projects had required more cash than expected. The loan, he said, had been used to protect payroll, equipment, and supplier relationships. He had borrowed the money 8 months earlier because he believed the problem would correct itself before I ever needed to know. Now the lender wanted stronger household financial support before restructuring the balance, and my income and credit would make the application easier. I asked where the money had gone. Mark answered with categories rather than records: payroll, materials, equipment, operating expenses. He named several projects I recognized and described delays I knew had happened, which made the explanation convincing in the way practiced explanations often are. Good lies rarely depend on invented facts. They depend on arranging real facts so carefully that the missing ones do not attract attention. Diane waited until Mark had finished before telling me that he had employees with families depending on him and that a temporary sacrifice from me could protect everything he had built. Then she said, "Your credit can recover. His company may not." That sentence stayed with me because of how naturally she said it. Diane did not believe she was insulting me. She believed she was explaining the obvious order of importance. Mark's company was something valuable enough to protect. My financial security was something flexible enough to spend. For most of my marriage, I had interpreted Diane's attitude toward me as a personality conflict. She considered me cautious. I considered her intrusive. She praised Mark for taking risks and teased me for researching everything before spending money. When one of his relatives needed help, she reminded everyone that Rachel had the steady job. When Mark invested in new equipment, it was ambition. When I increased our emergency savings, it was anxiety. None of those moments had seemed important enough to fight over alone. That night I realized families rarely announce who is expected to sacrifice. They establish it slowly, through hundreds of ordinary decisions, until one person's stability becomes a resource everyone else assumes they can use. I asked to see the original loan documents, 8 months of business statements, and a breakdown of how the money had been spent. Mark became irritated. Diane said construction companies did not operate like dental offices and suggested I was allowing my professional habits to make a family problem unnecessarily complicated. I did not sign. Mark slept in the guest room that night. After he went upstairs, I remained at the kitchen table reading the agreement. The outstanding balance was still more than $81,000. For a short-term loan supposedly used to bridge delayed client payments, the principal had barely moved. 2 notices had been mailed to an address on Henderson Road that belonged neither to our house nor Mark's office. I wrote the address down. I did not yet know why it mattered. I only knew that numbers do not become offended when you question them, and documents do not accuse you of failing to support your husband. The next morning I arrived at the dental practice before 7. I spent several hours behaving as though my marriage had not changed overnight. I approved payroll adjustments, spoke to an insurance representative, handled a patient complaint, and reviewed staffing for the following month. During lunch, I closed my office door and opened the shared financial archive Mark and I had maintained since applying for our mortgage. Mark managed his company accounts himself, but several statements still synchronized automatically into a folder we used for taxes. Most of what I found looked ordinary. Supplier payments, insurance premiums, equipment leases, subcontractors, fuel, and payroll expenses appeared exactly where I expected them. Then I noticed a recurring payment of $2,675 to Wexler Property Management. It had been leaving one of Mark's business accounts every month for almost 2 years. I assumed it was a warehouse or storage lease. Mark already rented 2 commercial spaces, but those payments appeared elsewhere under different company names. Wexler did not appear in his tax summaries as a business landlord, and I could find no construction-related reason for the expense. I searched the company online. Wexler managed apartment complexes around Columbus, Dublin, and Worthington. Their leasing office was located on Henderson Road. The address matched the one receiving notices about the $86,000 loan. I sat in my office for several minutes trying to create explanations that would allow my marriage to remain what I believed it was. Maybe Mark rented temporary housing for an employee. Maybe the company used an apartment for visiting subcontractors. Maybe he had helped a relative and never mentioned it because he knew I would ask questions. Each possibility was technically possible. The problem was that every innocent explanation required another coincidence. That evening, Mark came home with takeout from one of my favorite restaurants and apologized for surprising me with the loan. He admitted he should have told me earlier and said embarrassment had made him secretive. I almost believed him because shame would have made sense. A man who built his identity around being a successful business owner might hide financial trouble from the person whose opinion mattered most. Then I asked again whether there were any major financial obligations I did not know about. He said no. I had not mentioned Wexler. That was the first lie I recognized as a lie before I knew what truth it was protecting. Over the next 2 days, I reviewed more records. Once I knew where to look, the apartment payments became part of a larger pattern. Charges appeared at a grocery store, pharmacy, dry cleaner, neighborhood restaurant, and children's clothing store near one of Wexler's properties. Some happened on weekday afternoons while Mark claimed to be at job sites. Others appeared on Sundays when he told me he was meeting clients. There were furniture purchases shortly before the first rent payment and a mattress delivery from a retailer less than a mile away. I created a spreadsheet separating confirmed facts from assumptions. It was not because I wanted to audit my husband. It was because fear has a way of making possibilities feel like facts, and I did not want anger deciding what I believed. Under confirmed facts, I listed the rent, the address, the nearby purchases, and the hidden account. Under possibilities, I listed employee housing, personal apartment, affair. I stared at the last word longer than I expected. People imagine discovering infidelity as one dramatic moment. A text appears. A photograph is found. Someone opens the wrong door. What I experienced was slower. Every transaction gave me enough information to become suspicious, but not enough to stop hoping. Hope can be generous when the truth is uncertain. It can also become a way of volunteering to misunderstand what is directly in front of you. On Thursday morning, I took a personal day and drove to Briarwood Commons, the apartment complex connected to the Henderson Road mailing address. It was less than 15 minutes from our house. I parked where I could see several buildings without attracting attention and immediately felt ridiculous. I was a 36-year-old dental practice manager sitting in a parking lot watching strangers carry groceries because I suspected my husband had rented an apartment in secret. I nearly left. Then I saw a black equipment case inside an open garage near Building 6. Mark's company logo was printed on the side. I recognized it because I had bought the case for his birthday 3 years earlier. Several months before, he had told me it had been stolen from a work truck and said the insurance company had reimbursed part of the loss. I photographed it from my car. At 11:38, Mark's truck entered the complex. According to his schedule, he was supposed to be meeting a client in Hilliard. Instead, he parked beside Building 6 and entered through a side door without ringing anyone. He had a key. For more than an hour, I sat there remembering ordinary parts of our marriage. Mark sanding our dining table in the garage. Mark bringing soup to my office when I had the flu. Mark sitting beside my father after his stroke. Mark falling asleep on the couch with a baseball game playing quietly after we spent an entire Saturday fixing our fence. Betrayal does not erase good memories. It forces you to reconsider what else may have been happening at the same time. When Mark came outside again, a woman walked beside him. She looked a little younger than me, with dark blonde hair pulled into a ponytail. A boy of about 5 ran ahead of them carrying a green plastic dinosaur. Mark lifted him onto his shoulders. The child covered Mark's eyes with both hands while the woman laughed and reached up to steady him. There was nothing sexual in what I saw. That made it worse. They looked familiar with one another in a way that did not belong to a recent affair. Mark knew where the child's jacket was. He fastened something into the back seat of the woman's SUV. He moved through that parking lot like someone performing a routine he had performed many times before. I took several photographs and returned to work. That night, Mark handed me a folder containing financial records. He had selected them carefully. They showed legitimate company expenses and enough cash flow pressure to support his story, but the account paying Wexler was missing. When I asked whether I was seeing all the accounts connected to the business, he said yes. By then, I no longer needed to decide whether he was lying. I needed to understand how long he had been doing it. The woman's name was Vanessa Lane. I found her through a combination of public social media posts and an old photograph tagged at a community event. She worked at a pediatric therapy clinic in Worthington. Most of her profile was private, but a Christmas photograph showed the same little boy beside a handmade wooden play kitchen. Mark burned a small M inside a square into the corner of every personal woodworking project he made. The mark was visible beneath the countertop. An older public photograph finally connected them. Vanessa was sitting with several people at a restaurant patio in Cincinnati. At the edge of the frame was Mark wearing a navy polo shirt I had bought him. The picture had been taken almost 6 years earlier, several years into our marriage. I no longer had to wonder whether the apartment represented a new affair. Whatever relationship existed between Mark and Vanessa had lasted long enough to become part of the structure of our marriage. Friday evening, Diane invited us to dinner. I almost refused, but I wanted to observe her before she knew what I had discovered. Diane's house had always functioned as a museum of Mark's importance. His high school trophies, business awards, photographs, and newspaper clippings filled the hallway. She spoke about his construction company as though she had helped build it, although she had never worked there. The lone dominated dinner. Diane repeated that marriage sometimes required one person to carry more weight when the other was struggling. I asked how much she had known about Mark's financial problems before Tuesday. She said he had mentioned some cash flow concerns but had not told her the exact amount. Then I asked whether she knew he received business mail at another address. She looked at Mark before answering. It lasted less than a second. That glance changed the investigation. I asked her privately after dinner whether there was anything about Mark's finances or personal life that I should know before taking responsibility for $86,000. Diane avoided giving me a direct answer. She said every marriage contained matters that became more difficult when outsiders interfered, and that sometimes asking too many questions created damage that patience could have prevented. She believed she was warning me. What she actually did was confirm that Mark's secret had more than one guardian. The following morning, I reviewed the $86,000 loan transactions again. The money had entered Mark's business account in one deposit, but had scattered almost immediately. $18,500 went to Wexler Property Management. Another $31,000 moved into an investment account. Approximately $12,000 went to an account ending in 4471. Smaller transfers followed. Very little went directly to payroll. The business problems Mark described were real, but they were not the reason the loan existed. On Sunday morning, I drove back to Briarwood. By then, I had identified the apartment number through an insurance billing change Mark had apparently forgotten was visible on a shared account. Apartment 214 was on the second floor of Building 6. A pair of small red sneakers sat outside the door, and a package beside them was addressed to Vanessa Lane. I had intended only to confirm the unit and leave. Vanessa opened the door before I could. I introduced myself. She knew my name. The recognition on her face eliminated whatever uncertainty remained about whether she understood who Mark was married to. A little boy appeared behind her carrying the same dinosaur I had seen in the parking lot. He noticed a photograph of Mark's truck in my hand, pointed toward it, and said, "That's my dad." Until that moment, I had prepared myself to discover a mistress. I had not prepared myself to discover a son. Vanessa invited me inside after sending Noah back to his cartoon. She did not deny the relationship or attempt to make me believe I had misunderstood what I had seen. What surprised me was that her version of the story did not begin with a married man openly seeking an affair. She had met Mark in Cincinnati almost 6 years earlier at a business event. He told her he was separated and that his divorce had been delayed because the house and company finances were complicated. She believed him until nearly a year later, when she saw a photograph Diane had posted showing Mark and me together. When Vanessa confronted him, Mark admitted we were still legally married but described our relationship as functionally over. According to him, we lived separate emotional lives and had agreed not to discuss other relationships while we untangled our finances. None of that was true. During the same period, Mark and I had celebrated our 5th anniversary with a trip to South Carolina. He had written me a card about being grateful that our marriage felt stronger every year. Vanessa tried to end the relationship after realizing he had lied. A few months later, she discovered she was pregnant. Noah was born 5 years earlier. Mark had supported him privately from the beginning. At first, the payments came from personal accounts. Later, as his business became more profitable, he routed increasing amounts through the company. When Vanessa moved to Columbus for work, Mark arranged the Briarwood apartment because he wanted to be close enough to see Noah regularly without changing the life he had with me. He had been promising Vanessa for almost 2 years that he would tell me. I asked how much Diane knew. The answer changed the betrayal from something inside my marriage to something inside the entire family. Diane had known before Noah was born. Mark went to her after Vanessa threatened to contact me herself. Diane drove to Cincinnati and met Vanessa privately. She helped with expenses during the pregnancy, sent birthday and Christmas gifts after Noah was born, and occasionally visited him. Noah knew her as his grandmother. For 5 years, Diane had sat across from me at family dinners, knowing her son had a child I had never heard about. She had made comments about whether Mark and I would ever have children. She had once told me that motherhood was an experience a career could never replace. I remembered going home after that conversation wondering whether my uncertainty about becoming a mother had disappointed my husband. At the time Diane said it, she already had a grandson. Vanessa then explained why the financial situation had become urgent. Mark's support had become inconsistent during the previous year, as several construction projects ran into real cash flow problems. Vanessa had tolerated informal arrangements for years because Mark promised eventually to acknowledge Noah openly. She finally consulted a family law attorney and prepared to establish paternity and support formally. Mark panicked. Formal proceedings would create financial records, require disclosures, and make it almost impossible to continue hiding Noah from me. He and Diane persuaded Vanessa to delay filing while Mark caught up on what he owed, prepaid part of the apartment lease, and created an education account for Noah. The amounts matched the transactions I had traced. The $18,500 payment to Wexler resolved unpaid rent and prepaid additional months. The $31,000 transfer went into a custodial investment account for Noah. The account ending in 4471 belonged to Vanessa and had received support payments for years. The $86,000 loan had not been borrowed because Mark suddenly needed to save his construction company. It had been borrowed because the financial system he used to hide his son had become too expensive to maintain. I did not suddenly decide Vanessa was innocent. She had remained involved with a married man after discovering the truth, and some of her choices had contributed to my deception. But by the time I left Briarwood, I no longer saw two women competing for the same husband. I saw two women who had been given different versions of the same man and encouraged to make decisions based on information he controlled. Mark told Vanessa I was a marriage he was trying to leave. He told me Vanessa did not exist. He told Diane he needed time to protect everyone. Each version allowed him to remain where he was. Before I left, Vanessa showed me emails involving Diane. One message affected me more than almost anything else I had learned. Diane argued that exposing the situation before Mark repaired his finances would hurt everyone, and described me as practical enough to adjust later. That was when I understood why they expected me to sign the loan. They did not intend to tell me everything and ask whether I was willing to help. They intended to make the financial consequences large enough that refusing would appear selfish. My practicality had become part of their plan. I spent the afternoon reviewing our own finances with a new question. I no longer cared only where the $86,000 had gone. I wanted to understand what Mark expected to happen after I signed. The proposed restructuring would have used my income and credit history to strengthen his repayment position. It also required broader disclosure of household assets. My savings, retirement contributions, and the equity in our home would make Mark appear far more financially secure than he actually was. The house mattered because most of the original down payment came from an inheritance my grandmother left me. Years earlier, the attorney handling her estate had insisted that I keep those funds separate until closing, so their source would remain documented. I had considered the advice overly cautious at the time. Now I was grateful for every page. I called a family law attorney named Laura Mitchell that afternoon. She had handled a property dispute for one of the dentists at my practice, and I trusted her because she did not promise dramatic outcomes. I told her about the loan, the hidden accounts, Vanessa, Noah, and the request for my signature. She told me to preserve everything I already had, obtain copies of our credit reports, avoid moving large sums of money without advice, and sign nothing. She also warned me not to turn betrayal into legal assumptions. A hidden relationship did not automatically mean every asset would become mine or every debt would become Mark's. The exact documents, source of funds, account ownership, and use of the borrowed money would matter. I appreciated that more than I expected. I did not need someone to promise revenge. I needed someone who understood reality better than Mark understood storytelling. When I returned home that evening, Mark and Diane were already sitting at our kitchen table with the loan documents between them. For the first time, I understood that their confidence was not based on believing I would never discover the truth. It was based on believing discovery would come too late to matter. I let Mark repeat the lender deadline. I let Diane explain that family members sometimes had to make painful sacrifices for one another. Neither mentioned Vanessa, neither mentioned Noah, neither mentioned the apartment or 5 years of hidden payments. When Mark finally asked whether I was going to sign, I looked at both of them and asked one question: who is Noah? The silence that followed was more honest than anything they had told me all week. Mark eventually admitted that Noah was his son. He immediately surrounded that admission with explanations. The relationship had begun during a difficult period in our marriage. He had believed we were drifting apart. He intended to tell me once he understood what he wanted. Then Vanessa became pregnant, the business expanded, his father became ill, and each delay made the next conversation harder. I listened while he transformed 6 years of choices into a sequence of unfortunate circumstances. Most of the circumstances were real. None of them required deception. Diane explained that Mark had been terrified when he told her about the pregnancy, and that she believed forcing him to confess immediately would destroy several lives. She said she had tried to protect Noah from instability and give Mark time to make responsible decisions. I asked whether she had ever intended to tell me herself. She said it was not her marriage, and therefore not her place. That answer told me more about Diane than an apology could have. Apparently, it had been her place to meet Vanessa, help pay expenses, visit Noah, advise Mark, participate in discussions about support, and pressure me to assume $86,000 in liability. Only honesty had fallen outside the boundaries of appropriate involvement. When I told them I had traced the loan transfers, Mark's tone changed. The conversation was no longer about a mistake in his personal life. It was about money he could not explain. He admitted that part of the loan had been used to catch up on Noah's support and secure the apartment, but he continued insisting the company also had legitimate financial problems. I agreed. The business had suffered. The lie was pretending those problems alone created the debt. For years, Mark had been moving money from the company into a second household, then replacing it when clients paid. The loan became necessary when there was no longer enough new money to cover the old withdrawals. I asked whether he planned to tell me about Noah before or after I signed. He never gave me an answer. Diane returned to the company and its employees. She spoke about mortgages, families, and jobs that might disappear if the lender refused to cooperate. That was when I finally understood the structure of their argument. They had spent 5 years hiding a truth because they claimed revealing it would cause too much damage. Now they wanted me to absorb the financial damage because revealing the truth had been delayed for 5 years. Secrecy had created the emergency, and they were using the emergency as a reason to continue the secrecy. I told them I had spoken to an attorney and would not sign. Mark immediately wanted to know what records I had shared and whether I intended to divorce him. Diane accused me of escalating a family crisis rather than allowing Mark time to repair it. I did not answer the divorce question that night. Emotionally, the marriage felt finished. Legally and financially, I wanted facts before decisions. Over the following weeks, a forensic accountant reviewed the records available to us. Mark moved temporarily into Diane's house while his attorney worked with the company accountant and lender. The process was far less dramatic than the confrontation stories people enjoy imagining. There were no police arriving at our door, no judge instantly transferring everything to me, and no magical document that erased 9 years of shared finances. There were statements, emails, tax records, loan agreements, account histories, and long conversations about which money belonged where. The accountant estimated that over approximately 5 years, Mark had directed more than $100,000 in company and personal funds toward expenses connected to Vanessa and Noah. That included rent, support, medical bills, furniture, insurance, travel, and the education account. I did not consider money spent supporting Noah inherently wrong. Mark was his father and had an obligation to support him. The problem was the system built around the payments. Some were hidden inside broad business categories. Others were paid through accounts Mark never disclosed to me. Company cash had been used to cover personal obligations and then replaced later when larger client payments arrived. The business had not become unstable because Mark had a son. It became unstable because Mark tried to be financially responsible for his son while remaining personally dishonest about his existence. Diane had also contributed significant money during Noah's early years. Her emails showed that when Mark could not make a payment without creating an obvious gap, she sometimes covered it and waited for reimbursement. For years, she had not merely protected the secret emotionally. She had helped finance it. The lender eventually refused the restructuring proposal that depended on my participation. Mark had to negotiate directly, sell equipment, reduce expenses, and close one of his storage facilities. Several employees left before the company stabilized at a smaller size. Diane told relatives that I had refused to help Mark after discovering he had a child from an old relationship. That version traveled quickly because it contained pieces of the truth. Mark had a child. The company was struggling. I refused to sign. What Diane removed was everything connecting those facts. She did not mention that Mark had maintained the relationship for years, hidden Noah for 5 years, moved money through business accounts, borrowed $86,000 without telling me, and asked me to strengthen the debt before revealing why the money was necessary. For several weeks, relatives sent messages about forgiveness, loyalty, and the importance of protecting a marriage through difficult periods. I stopped responding after I realized most of them were offering moral advice about a bill they would never be asked to pay. It is easy to recommend sacrifice when someone else is the sacrifice. I filed for divorce 7 weeks after meeting Noah. The financial negotiations were complicated but not catastrophic. Our house was jointly titled, so Mark did have an interest in it, but the documented inheritance contribution from my grandmother became important. We ultimately reached a settlement without trial. I refinanced the remaining mortgage, paid Mark an agreed amount reflecting his recognized share after other financial issues were considered, and kept the house. The result was not revenge. It was separation. The $86,000 obligation remained connected to Mark's business restructuring rather than becoming a debt I voluntarily guaranteed. Mark retained his company, I retained my career, most of the financial stability I had built, and the ability to stop wondering which part of my life would be used to rescue him next. Vanessa established paternity and formal child support after the truth became public within the family. I never became her friend. I did not believe that Mark lying to her at the beginning erased every decision she made afterward, but I also stopped needing her to be the villain of my story. Mark was responsible for the promises he made to both of us. Vanessa had lived for years waiting for him to tell me. I had lived for years believing there was nothing to tell. The person benefiting from both forms of patience was Mark. Noah was the only person involved who had made no choices at all. I saw him only once, at the apartment door. I did not believe inserting myself into his life would help him. He deserved to know his father without growing up believing his own existence had destroyed a marriage. The marriage had been damaged by decisions made before Noah was old enough to understand any of them. Diane contacted me twice during the divorce. The first time, she still believed I was punishing Mark for trying to support his son. I told her that supporting Noah was one of the few parts of the situation I did not object to. What I objected to was being deceived and then asked to finance the deception. The second call came months later. She said counseling had forced her to reconsider what she had called protection. She had believed that if she solved enough immediate problems, Mark would eventually become ready to tell the truth. Instead, every problem she solved gave him another reason to postpone it. I accepted the apology without offering reconciliation. Apologies can acknowledge damage without creating an obligation to rebuild access to the person who caused it. Mark wrote to me after the divorce became final. He said he had spent years telling himself he was protecting everyone. He protected me from pain, Vanessa from uncertainty, Noah from instability, Diane from shame, his employees from financial trouble, and the company from scandal. Eventually, he understood that protecting everyone was the phrase he used whenever he wanted to make decisions on their behalf without allowing them to know the truth. He apologized several times for the loan. By then, the $86,000 no longer felt like the worst part. It was simply the moment the cost of his secret became too large to remain hidden inside his own accounts. Before this happened, I believed financial security meant having enough savings to survive an emergency. I understand it differently now. Security also requires access to the truth. You cannot make responsible decisions about a marriage, a mortgage, a debt, or a future when another person decides which facts you are allowed to know. For years, Mark and Diane described my caution as rigidity. I asked for records. I wanted explanations. I saved statements. I kept inheritance documents. I refused to treat urgency as proof that a decision was wise. those habits had sometimes made me feel less spontaneous than the people around me. They were also the reason I did not sign my name beneath $86,000 of someone else's deception. There is a version of loyalty that means standing beside someone while they face the consequences of a mistake. I still believe in that kind of loyalty. There is another version that requires you to become part of the mistake so the person you love can avoid those consequences. I no longer confuse the two. Mark's greatest miscalculation was not believing that Vanessa and Noah could remain hidden forever. Secrets that large rarely survive permanently. His greater mistake was believing that if I eventually discovered the truth, the weight of our marriage, our house, his company, his employees, his mother, and 9 years of history would make leaving feel more frightening than staying. For a long time, he may have been right. What he failed to understand was that every hidden payment and every carefully edited explanation had already been changing the marriage, even while I knew nothing about them. By the time he placed that loan agreement in front of me, he believed he was asking me to save the life we had built together. He was actually asking me to finance the cost of discovering that the life I thought we had never fully existed. I did not sign. Mark's company survived, although smaller than before. Noah gained formal financial support from his father. Vanessa no longer depended on private promises. Diane could no longer call secrecy protection simply because the truth was uncomfortable. And I kept something everyone sitting at that kitchen table had assumed was available for negotiation: the right to decide which risks belonged to my own life. I do not hate Mark now. Hatred would require him to remain too important in a life I have worked hard to rebuild. I hope he becomes a better father than he was a husband. I hope Noah grows up understanding that there was never anything shameful about his existence. I even hope Diane continues learning that love without accountability can become another form of control. What I no longer hope for is a different ending to my marriage. The ending returned something I had slowly surrendered without realizing it: trust in my own questions. So tell me honestly, if your spouse asked you to sign an $86,000 debt and you later discovered the money was being used to support a hidden child and a second household, would you stay and try to rebuild the marriage, or would the years of deception be the point you could no longer cross?